Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the webinar room. We're going to get started in just a moment. Everyone entering the room, welcome. We're just going to take a moment longer just to let everybody file in. All right, I'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to our MPF Wetlands webinar, Return of the Wapato with Tracy Hames, Executive Director of the Wisconsin Wetlands Association. My name is Amanda Lance-Ramrap, and I am the Events and Communications Coordinator for the Missouri Prairie Foundation and Grow Native program. Thank you for joining us today for the next webinar of our Wetlands webinar series, which aims to bring awareness to the many dimensions and benefits of wetlands conservation. When you have questions about the presentation, please type them in the Q&A section on your Zoom screen, which you'll find on the bar at the bottom of your window. Questions placed into the chat will be redirected to the Q&A section. Lily Germeroth, our MPF Conservation Program Associate, will join Tracy on screen at the end of the presentation to read your submitted questions aloud. Thank you in advance for your thoughtful live submissions. Access to this recording and other related information will be sent to all who registered in a follow-up email Friday, as we are closed to honor the Juneteenth holiday on Thursday. Now to introduce our speaker, Tracy Hames. Tracy was raised in Arden Hills, Minnesota, obtaining a BA in Biology and Environmental Studies from Macalester College in 1984 and an MS in Natural Resources from the University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point in 1990. For 22 years, Tracy worked as a waterfowl and wetlands biologist for the Yakama Nation. At Yakama, he helped build one of the largest agricultural-based wetland protection and restoration projects in the Pacific Northwest. This project made use of the cultures and traditions of the Yakama people, along with science-based techniques. Encompassing over 22,000 acres and hundreds of river and creek miles, this project emphasized the restoration of historic conditions in an incredibly disturbed landscape. Restoration activities targeted floodplains, river and creek channels, wetlands, riparian forests, and grasslands, but we're going to get all into that in just a moment. Tracy moved back to Wisconsin in 2012 to take the position of Executive Director with the Wisconsin Wetlands Association. In this position, he works across the state to help communities understand how wetlands can be solutions to the habitat, water quality, flooding, and other issues they face. Wisconsin's Wetlands Association is a nonpartisan, science-based, statewide nonprofit organization dedicated to the protection, restoration, and enjoyment of Wisconsin's wetlands. WWA helps individuals, communities, and decision makers throughout Wisconsin gain the knowledge and guidance needed to protect and care for their local wetlands. All right, Tracy, thank you for providing us this case study on the Yakama Nation Reservation's cultural approach to wetland and floodplain protection. I'll turn things over to you.
Thanks, Amanda, and welcome everybody, and thanks for having me on. And hopefully I'll be able to present a subject that will be of interest to some of the folks, at least. It's of interest to me. Yeah, thanks for that introduction. I will dive right in. I've got a lot to cover, and then we'll have a Q&A and discussion afterwards. And I'm available to talk wetlands as long as you guys want to talk wetlands. Title today is Return of the Wapato, and you'll see Wapato and this plant described in several different ways with different names: Wapato, Wapato, arrowhead, duck potato, a lot of different things. We know it as the genus Sagittaria. Most of the plants I think that we'll be talking about today are Sagittaria latifolia, and we'll be talking about how the Yakama Nation was able to bring this plant back after being gone for well over 100 years in the agricultural portion of the reservation. So let's dive right in. As I said, for 22 years, from 1989 to 2012, I worked as a wildlife and wetlands biologist with the Yakama Nation Wildlife Resource Management Program. The Yakama Nation, the treaty they have with the United States was written and signed in 1855. it delineated the land base and the rights that were reserved, and delineated the ceded area, etc. And one thing about the Yakamas is they've never reorganized. They've never done any rewriting or re-signing or changing of any of their relationship with the federal government since the Treaty of 1855. So they're still working off their original treaty, and that's rare these days across the nation. And the treaty delineated the area within which the Yakamas agreed would be their reservation, and delineated the areas within which they retained the ceded area, where they retained hunting and fishing and gathering and other rights. And this map shows that. I show this just to orient everybody of where we are on the earth here. This is Washington State, the Cascade Mountains. The west border of the reservation is the crest of the Cascade Mountains, and the land goes eastward to the Yakama River. The elevation on the reservation literally goes from 12,000 feet down to about 1,000 feet on the eastern end. And it's the rain shadow. Much of the reservation is in the Cascade Mountain rain shadow, which means the eastern portion of the reservation is very arid, 4 to 6 inches of precip a year in that landscape. Whereas on the west side, that's, very deep snowpack up in the mountains. And it's those mountain snowpacks that feed the rivers and the water courses flowing eastward, the courses that we'll be talking about today. It's all mountain-based hydrology. So we're going to start out with a video created by Emily Washeen. She's a tribal member that did her master's work, and this was a part of the master's project that she did. And so we'll show this video as an introduction to the subject, and then we'll talk about how this came about after we watch this short video. So let's see if I can get this started. There we go. Oh, I'm so sorry.
Here is a rock grade control structure which emulates what a beaver dam does, and that it lifts up Toppenish Creek. And the water table around it to allow the natural vegetation to grow freely.
So yeah, the woman that was out in the water there harvesting, that was Emily herself. She would have liked to have been giving this presentation, but she was not available. So I'm the stand-in. But a lot of this, a lot of the work promoting Wapato in helping bring it back with the tribe was her work. I was the person managing and doing a lot of the restoration work in the area. So I wanted to show the Toppenish Creek Basin. That's a lot of what where we're going to be talking about today. And you can see this is a very agriculturally developed area. The yellow line is the watershed basin, all within the boundaries of the reservation. It's about less than a third of the land base of the reservation. You can see the Yakama River flowing on the eastern boundary where it says Wapato and Toppenish. Just east of that is the Yakama River, and the big blue line at the bottom of the watershed is Toppenish Creek. So like I said, origin of the water is higher elevation, snow-derived hydrology down into the arid portion. What's happened, in the early 1900s was in this whole area, the arid West was developed into irrigated agriculture. And when we did that, we turned everything upside down in these areas to grow food in these places that have 4 to 6 inches of precip a year. We developed dams and canals and ditches and all kinds of things that literally removed all the natural habitat, almost all the vegetation in these irrigation developed landscapes. And so really hard to bring that stuff back when you have things disturbed as much as that. Ultimately what happened is they put in reservoirs in the mountains to hold the spring snowmelt and reduce that snowmelt in the spring, and then release those waters in the late summer when naturally it was a drier time of year and the rivers and wetlands were naturally drier. Well, it turned the water upside down. It was drier in the times when it was normally wetter and wetter in the times that was normally drier. And that really impacts the ability for wetlands to grow the plants and support the animals that they need to. So back in the late 70s, the Yakama Nation decided, some of the tribal elders said, look, we've lived, this portion of the reservation has been so disturbed, we've lost all our resources, our cultural and traditional resources. We want to start working to bring them back in this developed portion of the res. And so they put together what they called the Toppenish Creek Restoration Plan. That was in the late 70s. I was hired on in the late 80s, 1989, to help put the plans together to start working to build the project to bring these resources back. And when we started in 89, we had not 1 acre of land managed for wetland or riparian or wildlife or traditional use in the agricultural portion of the reservation. By the time I left, the red areas here is over 22,000 acres. So we were busy boys and girls over these years getting land put into the project and getting it restored and cared for. And we came up with a process to guide our work. And it was really thinking about what are the needs of the Yakama people. And so this is what it really came down to. The Yakama culture, thinking of it this way, evolved. They've been on this land since time immemorial. They were not removed to a reservation. They said, we're going to hold on to this place here in the treaty. So they've been on this landscape and resources for thousands and thousands of years, as far back as anybody can ever know. So the idea was to maximize the cultural benefit to the Yakama people. We wanted to bring back historic resources in their historic locations and restore those resources in the relative proportions in which they existed historically. And that's a really important point, because oftentimes we look at one thing or another and say, oh, I'm a duck biologist. How do I make this place best for a duck? We didn't take that approach. We said, what was here before? How can we bring back the resources in the proportions and in the locations they existed, not emphasizing one over the other. And the other really important point I want to emphasize is that it all begins with the water. And the Yakama people know this. When they have meetings, they start by drinking a glass of water ceremonially. And so they know that how fundamentally important water is. So let's talk about how we did this. So like I said, cultural natural resources restoration, emphasizing the native processes, functions, and conditions. In other words, get the land back in as much as possible a condition it existed historically, but doing it in the modern context. We're not pulling the reservoirs out. We're not getting rid of all that agricultural acreage. So what can we do to bring back the resources and the values that we're looking for? So we developed this 3 questions approach. And by the way, I'm still using this approach even in Wisconsin now, and promoting this thinking about land management, restoration, and care. So the first question is, how did this area function historically? Going back in this situation, we had to go back to glacial times and really put together what went on, what did this place look like, how did the water move especially, and that's a lot of sleuth work. There's not any eyewitnesses going on back then, but we'll talk a little bit about how we came up with that. And then what have we changed? What have all the changes that have happened over the last, more or less 150 years to alter those historic conditions? And what can we do then to restore and manage or care for the land to some semblance of historic condition, but in a modern context? And the modern context is the most important part of that, because you have to make decisions. You're not bringing everything back to 150 years ago. So how do we do it? How do we get what we need and change what we can? So the first question was, how did this place look and function historically? So we utilized tribal resources, talking to elders, consulting the stories. Amazing, all those Yakama stories were from this landscape, looking at traditional practices and the resources that were utilized. If they were utilizing resources historically, they must have existed in some level of abundance. And looking at archaeological resources, anything you can to understand how the people utilize the resources in the landscape in this area. Now, here's the structure here. You'll see some mats on this, and we'll look at those in a minute here, and we'll talk about what those are. But the tribal resources, especially talking to elders, was some of the most important. And I will say right now at the beginning, when we went out and talked to the elders about the area, Topnish Creek, we were working within, what they told us about that creek in the stories and what they learned from their oral traditions didn't match at all with what we were seeing there and what we understood. So we had to scratch our heads and say, I believe what you're saying, but I can't understand how the place could have looked like what you're talking about. And guess what? It took us 15 years using science and all these other things to catch up with the tribal stories. And when we finally understood how the place was formed from our Western science standpoint, oh my God, everything came together. It was so exciting. And I have chills even now thinking about that process and how neat that was. So part of that also then was using science to understand the past. Geomorphological surveys, the old original land surveys in the 1800s, remnant habitat areas, which were almost non-existent in the agricultural valley, archaeological surveys, published literature, historic documents, all these things coming together and helping us understand the historic conditions in this area we call Topnish Creek. So what we found out was before 1700, before a lot of changes occurred brought in by Europeans, this is what Topnish Creek looked like. This is a little schematic. And you had a multi-channeled, very broad floodplain waterway with maybe a main channel running through the middle, and all these side channels and wetlands, and everything was held together by beavers. One very interesting thing we found out when we started digging pits out there into these wetland areas along the creek, when you're digging a hole out in that part of the country, you come across the Mazama ash layer. And when you hit that ash layer, that's 7,300 years ago, because that's when Mount Mazama blew its top, which is now Crater Lake, and it sent a layer of ash everywhere in the Northwest. we were finding beaver chewed sticks below the Mazama ash layer. Is that humbling? You know, when you pull a stick out that you knew a beaver chewed on 7,300 years ago. Wow. And so that was really a big part of helping us understand what was going on in this watershed, amongst other things. So then the second question is, what's changed? What have we done out here to change, you know, these conditions that we were learning about existed historically? And like I said, most of the changes occurred recently in the last 150 years. Irrigated agricultural development and all the things associated with that, roads, bridges, levees, you know, narrowed down the floodplains, caused the channels to get disconnected or in size. Upper watershed changes affected the amount of water flowing down into the area. Hydrology was altered, vegetation was removed, but in a lot of cases, the landscape was still intact. We had the luxury of working in a place where they didn't really flatten a lot of it, some of it, but not all of it. So here's a picture of one section of Topnish Creek, and you can see the multiple channels running through here. Historically, this whole thing was wetlands in between it. And what happened was people dug ditches and forced the water that was across the landscape into one channel on the lower portion of this photo, the channelized section, dried the whole area up. And then there was a really big drain on the north end of it, Marion Drain, that drained the agricultural land to the north. And by the 1950s, this is what this area looked like, a channelized section and a bunch of high and dry channels in wetlands and landscape like that. Really, really heavily disturbed because the water was removed. So the third question is, how do we restore and manage these resources using the historic conditions as a guide, but in a modern context? And that, number one, meant getting the land base secured. I was buying a lot of land that went out of tribal ownership and getting it back in tribal ownership. We had a cultural and archaeologists working with us, and they were the first ones ever to go out on the properties and set the stage for everything else. An interdisciplinary approach, you have to bring in people with a whole multi perspective. Nobody knows everything, and the connections and how everything it fits together is such that you need everybody working together with different expertise to put this story together. And then what, like I said again, restore hydrology, the water first. And with us, it really meant bringing the floodplains back, getting the land flooding again, getting the wetlands and the channels restored, and restore the resources in historic proportions, as we said earlier, managing the properties using traditional ways of managing the properties. We'll talk about that in a minute, and monitor and tweak it as you need, as you learn and see what's happening on the landscape. So we're going to key in on one property on Topnish Creek. It's called the South Ladder Lake Wildlife Area. In Emily's video, she calls it the Zimmerman property because that was the previous white landowner that we bought the property from. We purchased this property in the early 90s, and it was heavily disturbed, and we had to do a lot of restoration out here to get the conditions back. So we'll look closely at this property here. It's about 430 acres, so relatively small property compared to a lot of the others. But this is the property in 1937, and Topnish Creek is flowing on the southern portion of this photo. And what happened here was on the red line, especially on the left side, the west side, the upstream side, water's flowing from left to right in this photo. Levees were put in, and the whole wetland multi-channel complex was disconnected, not only from the floodplain, but literally from flowing through altogether. Channels were buried, wetlands were all filled, and it was all developed into irrigated agricultural fields. This is what it looked like just before we purchased the property in 1992. It was all broken up into units. There was no water flowing across it anymore. It was all irrigated from the north, from irrigation water from the north, disconnected from its floodplain. Oh my goodness, how do you bring something like this back? So we had to, it was expensive, but we had to literally redig the channels and bring the wetland basins back in and get the water flowing again from the creek through this property. And by 1996, it looked like this. So we got the flow back in, we opened up the levees, and got the flow, got some of the wetlands back. It still has the straight lines from the original agricultural fields because it was just too expensive to get rid of those. So we got the water flowing and it was functioning correctly, and the wetlands were getting water back in, and things were going off from there. Now, I will say right now that in all the years, 22 years working out here on all these projects, over 20,000 acres, not once in our restoration efforts did we ever plant any wetland plants or any riparian plants. Our approach was get the hydrology back on, do some weed control, and see what happens. So reconnecting the water on this property for 75 years, this was wheat fields and hay fields and things. And there's a photo from 1982, the same photo from the same vantage point in 2006 when the wetlands were restored. You can see Wapato in the foreground and a lot of tule in this picture as well. And we'll talk about tule in a minute. So here's what it looked like beforehand. This was the main channel of Topnish Creek, high and dry. And all the water was in channels and ditches, keeping this place dry. So, and then grazed down to dirt for over 100 years. So grazed down, the vegetation was removed, the water was removed, but we still relatively had the landscape intact in terms of the wetland bases were still there, the channels were still there, but they were dry as a bone. So one thing we had to do was get the water reconnected into these systems. And one simple measure we used was things we called grade control structures to lift the water up to get it flowing into these channels again. And these were rock structures that really hold the grade and lift it up a little bit. And by the way, these were all salmonid bearing waterways. So everything we did had steelhead use, federally threatened steelhead going right through these systems here. And the idea was kind of to mimic beaver dams to get the water raised up and reconnected to the floodplain to start letting the water heal the land and heal the vegetation. Now, this one was put in 2007. You can see a lot of vegetation removal during construction, but within a very few years, all that vegetation grew back and it healed itself really well. The structure's still there, and the creek is stabilized at a higher level, closer to natural. And by 2024, I still go out there a lot and visit my friends and even go duck hunting in these areas. And no change in all these years with these structures, almost 20 years later, 17 years later. And like I say, they're mimicking beaver dams. And the reason, you say, well, why didn't you just get beavers in there and let them do their thing? Well, they were there and they would build dams on the creek, and every spring they would wash out. Because the floodplain was not connected, the water all stayed in the channels and would blow out anything a beaver tried to do. So we put the grade controls in to connect it enough and reduce the energy of the runoff enough to allow the beavers then to move in, and they did in gangbusters. In fact, we started the process, then we stepped back and let the beavers take over from here. So it was really exciting seeing that. And this is what that channel that I showed you looks like once it had water again. Boy, here we are. Been 100 years without water in that channel. So really exciting times, and then seeing the vegetation respond. And I want to emphasize, a lot of people, we talk about getting it wet again, but it's not just about getting it wet. You have to understand how the water moved and flowed and the cycle, the hydrologic cycle in the area within which you're working. If you just got it wet again, remember how disturbed the whole area was. We wouldn't have had the success we did. Wetland plants need a very oftentimes narrow band of rise and fall of water to exist. And if you just got something wet, but it was wet at different seasons than it existed historically, you'll end up with weeds. So we knew that on Topnish Creek, because of mountain-based hydrology, that snow melt, that white stuff in the mountains is what was providing the water here. In the springtime, when the snow is melting, you have high waters here naturally, and they flow through these wetlands and through all the channels and across the floodplain. And as the summer goes on and you're using up all that snow in the mountains, it gets drier and drier and drier. And by the end of the summer, naturally then, a lot of these wetlands would be dry as a bone or a lot drier than they were earlier in the year. And the plants that existed there were adapted to that rise and fall, that style of hydrology. And here's a picture of the one wetland that we showed earlier with the dog in it. And this is all Wapato through here. But we had to fake it because the water was altered throughout the valley. We had to use water control structures to rise and fall and drop the water in a more natural manner, because if we just let the water flow like it did in this irrigated landscape, it wouldn't have brought helped the plants that we were growing. So management was important. And also reconnecting the floodplain. Sometimes there's a lot of different techniques, and if people have questions, we can talk about that later. But a lot of times it means getting water across roadways and things like that, and getting the water spread out. That's one of the most important things when you're thinking about these kind of systems. Floodplains need to flood. You can't bring back floodplain functions if the land doesn't flood. And we use traditional management in these wetland areas to provide, just like they had for thousands of years. In this situation, because we couldn't burn here, we're mowing instead. That was our substitute, modern substitute for the traditional practice in this year of burning this wetland. And see, this is in the late summer when it's all dry. You can even get out there in a tractor. That's how dry these places are. And these are all wetland plants here. We did a lot of burning. Burning was really an important part of the management of these areas. So once we got hydrologic processes reconnected, and during the dry time of year, late summer, early fall, we'd put a torch to it all. And we'll talk a little bit about when we did it in a second. When we got the vegetation back, naturally, these plants were ready for traditional harvest in late summer, and folks would come out and get them. And after the harvest was done, then we would burn it. And that would recreate conditions for the next spring. There's a whole story behind there, and it brought not only the plants back for traditional use, but it maximized the wildlife use of these areas and all the other connections. It's bringing back the pieces as much as you can. And when you do that, exciting and things happen that maybe you didn't know would happen. And immediately this stuff came up. These are tules. This is also known as hardstem bulrush. Schonaplectus is the genus. Very important traditional plant with the Yakamas and with tribes across the nation. They would make the mats out of these that they used for their structures historically. And now they use the mats for a lot of other purposes and traditional purposes and ceremonies. So in these areas with the tules coming back up, then we were able to manage the water in a historic manner, and that meant drying it out in late summer. And the harvesters would come out then, they wouldn't have to walk in water, and they were able to harvest the tules. When they were done harvesting and they told us they were done, then we'd put a torch to the whole thing, and that would reset the whole thing for next year. And what that did was it removed the dead material, so the next spring the tules could grow tall and straight and be really high quality for making tule mats. And this is what a tule mat looks like. So it's a bunch of bulrush, tied together, and historically they use these a lot for their structures. What about the Wapato? So it took a longer time for the Wapato to return to these areas. And the area where I just showed you where they were harvesting tules, that's the same wetland where Emily was harvesting her Wapato in the video. And Wapato was a very, very common plant in wetlands in the Pacific Northwest, and very important for all the Northwest tribes. You read a lot about it and you hear stories about it. It had been gone on the Yakama Reservation totally. Well, I knew of one little spot where some of it grew, but it was gone for well over 100 years. And so the tribe, the tribal members lost connection with the plant. They didn't, their oral stories, and that's the thing, when you're connected with oral stories and you're out there practicing your traditional cultural uses, you're out there physically doing these things. When the plant's gone for over 100 years, and there's a few generations that don't have experience with this plant, start losing your connection with it. So when it started coming back, we brought the elders out there, we showed folks, and they were relearning how to recognize the plant, how to grow the plant, how to harvest the plant, how to prepare the plant, and then they started using it traditionally. And that was really exciting because as a non-tribal biologist like me, it's exciting enough for us to bring back native conditions for wildlife and water and plants and everything. But here we're helping bring back portions of Yakama traditional and cultural use that had been lost for over 100 years. So this is what it looks like out there in the wetland. And the tubers are the important part of the Wapato plant. That's what's utilized. So you saw in the video Emily doing what we called the Wapato wiggle, where you use your feet and you stir up the mud and those tubers, and that's how they overwinter. They overwinter as tubers and float up. So they would do the harvest oftentimes when it was still wet. The water would be getting lower and lower after this point, and then we'd burn it later. But this is when they would do the harvest. And then they were bringing it in, preparing it, learning how to cook it, prepare it, etc. When I first tried it on my own, I boiled some up, and it didn't taste very good to me. But then when the tribal folks were talking to each other and bringing the recipes back, it was really delicious. And then they started using it in their longhouse ceremonies, a lot of different functions. This woman here, by the way, she was in her 80s when this photo was taken. She'd not had Wapato since she was a small child. So that was really exciting. So this is a slide from my talk from last winter, but lessons are not just for waterfowl managers. The talk I gave last time was for that. Was a lot of us in resource management are taught, and I'm a waterfowl, when I graduated from college, I was a waterfowl, I was a duck biologist. And I was taught back in the 80s that it's my job as a duck biologist to go out and make something best for a duck. Well, then I ended up going out west working for a salmon tribe that didn't really care about ducks. Well, they did by the time I left, but they lost their connection with it. So I had to rethink everything. And what am I doing? Why am I doing it? And we came up with this traditional cultural approach, bring everything back in the proportions that they existed historically. And guess what? That was the best thing for waterfowl as well. The ducks responded to this approach to management very strongly as well. And so it was really exciting. And when you think about it, we know so little about all the connections in nature. And when you take this approach, try and bring back as much as possible the natural functions, especially the way the water flowed and moved, that starts to bring all the other things back. And the results are 100-fold what you would have if you were just looking at something as a single species approach. So that's it. And I'm happy to have discussion or questions, or, I went over this quickly, but anything I can do to answer your questions, I'm here for you.
Thank you, Tracy. That was such a moving presentation, and I was in particular moved by how it began with the water and how you didn't plant anything. You just set the stage and just saw what arose. Can you speak to seeing what species came back, and maybe if you saw some things come back earlier or some areas? Could you just speak more to that?
Yeah, so let me talk, and I'll talk about this property because this was such a disturbed site. This was way more disturbed than a lot of the other sites. Like I said, it was all sectioned off, and it was for 100 years, it was dry land growing, irrigated wheat and things like that. Should I stop my sharing?
You can leave it up in case we want to.
By the way, this is a photo of this is Mount Adams in the background of this photo. That's the western boundary of the reservation. That's a large volcano. So the top of Mount Adams is the west boundary of the res. So you're looking at Pato, they call it. And this is one of those wetlands that was a wheat field. So when we first connected this stuff, we had to bring the flow back in. And this is something we learned really quickly, is that it isn't just about how wet or how dry a wetland is, but it's also about the nature of the water. Is the water bubbling up out of the groundwater source? Is it flowing in from a creek or a river? Is there flow to the water, or is it standing still? All the characteristics are important, and they affect the resources, especially the vegetation that will grow in those wetlands. So thinking about that, and here we are, floodplain area, lots of channels. The water flowed into these areas and flowed out. So we had to reconnect the flow through these wetland systems and allow them to flood up to their natural, to the natural way in the spring, and then dry on back down. Because these things were so disturbed, it was interesting. The first year we flooded up the wetlands on this property, it came in solid cattails. And the cattail in this area now, in most of the US, is a hybrid cattail, which is not native. That's a long story short. We don't need to go into it, but it was a weed, and it came in solid cattail. So what did we do? We applied traditional management. We went out there and allowed the wetlands to dry up in the late summer. Then we literally went out with mowers and mowed all that cattail down. And then knowing that the wetlands naturally would flood up starting in the fall. Oh, by the way, after we cut the cattails, let them dry for a few days, then we burned them. And when you're burning cattails, the smoke that comes up, oh my goodness, it looks like the whole valley's on fire, puts up that much smoke. So we always had to call the fire people and say, hey, we're going to be burning these wetlands down here, so don't worry. Anyway, so we burned all that stuff, and then we allowed the water to come back in the fall and reflood the whole thing up. And it only took a couple of years of that weed management. We didn't spray, we just did mechanical, and we started seeing the native stuff coming up. And the first stuff, like I said, was some of the tules. And it was funny because, you're also talking about decades of fertilization in these farm fields, right? So you had a lot of latent nutrients in the soil, and wetlands normally are not that nutrient rich in the soils. So some of these tules, when they first started coming up with all that fertilizer, they were huge. I mean, the basal area of these tules were giant, not appropriate for tule mats. So it was interesting to see that, like a tule on Miracle Grow or something. And the tules came back, and then we kept repeating the management: mow, burn, dry up, mow it, burn it, dry up, mow it, burn it. And the tules came in, and we started seeing all the other stuff was coming in, the natural plants, a lot of sedges and different things. And it was about, maybe it might have been 6 or 7 years, maybe 5, 6, 7 years, when I first started to see our first Wapato plant. And Wapato, is actually a common plant in a lot of the US. All of you in the Midwest know what arrowhead is, duck potato, Sagittaria, but it had been lost in the Northwest because of the incredible disturbance, these irrigated landscapes. The Wapato grew more in the valleys than it did up in the mountains. So you don't normally see it up in the mountains, you see it in the valleys. And I will tell you, when you go around the country, some of the absolute, especially from a wetland hydrologic standpoint, disturbed areas in our nation is in the arid West that we've turned into irrigated landscapes. We did not have 1 acre of land anywhere, upland or wetland, anywhere in the valley portion of the reservation that we could say, this is a natural area. This looks like it did 100 years ago. They were all gone. So the sleuth work of putting all this story together and using the cultural stories and everything was really exciting, and is what it took. And it guided us putting the water back, and then we let nature go from there. We've had to do very little management in this area to maintain the values. More than just, we started using haying in this area for some reasons, especially on years when they didn't want us burning. And so haying provided the same value. And actually, we had farmers going out and making hay bales of the wetland plants, and I guess feeding it to their livestock. So that worked out well as well. But the important part was getting rid of the dead material at the end of the growing season. That was the important part. And that's why these wetlands had been burned, for thousands and thousands of years. It produced those plants that were traditionally important. So weed control, important. If we wouldn't have restored the rise and fall of the water and the flow, we would have probably had very different wetland communities in, plants coming in here, and a lot of them would have been weeds. By the way, just about every weed known, to humans are in these agricultural landscapes. So it's not that we didn't have weeds here, we did.
That's my first thought is, oh, you bring water back in and who knows what will sprout again. So to hear that there was maybe this early wave of cattails, but then instead of kind of getting locked in that first wave, you applied that traditional management and removed that biomass. And then so it must have just been in the seed bank,
That's a big
plants.
question. There's a lot of discussion about that. Where'd this stuff come from? Was it in the seed bank? It's been 100 years, probably. The other thing, well, maybe it came in on a duck's foot. I always take offense to that because people always use that term, especially for bad things. I've banded thousands and thousands of ducks over the years and held so many in my hands in the job here, and never found anything stuck to a duck's foot. So don't use that phrase, please. Up a duck's butt, maybe, but that's another story. So, yeah, it really was that, but I have to emphasize, and I will say this over and over again, you have to fix the water, but you have to fix the water correctly. And I see that over and over again, where people will go in and make something wet again. Oftentimes they say, I'm re-wetting it. That's fine, that's good. But if you don't re-wet it to the rise and fall or the characteristics that existed there historically, you'll be fighting weeds for a long time. Bring the conditions back that give the competitive edge to the native stuff. And that's number one. The best weed control you can do is get the situation, get the conditions right, especially the water.
Thank you. Could you speak a little bit more to what this bringing water back in looked like? Was it, did you dig channel or, can you paint a picture for me? This was
really one of the fun parts of the job I had out there, the work we were doing, is we were working in so many different situations. A lot of the work we were doing was on the Yakama River, which is a much bigger river. Tompkins Creek was smaller. We had another creek just south of here called Sadis Creek. And the situation and the disturbances, the three questions, how did this place function, what's changed, was different from property to property to property. So there's no recipe book approaches for this type of work. You have to go through the three questions approach and then act appropriately. And plus we had the whole thing, this is salmonid water, so we had to make sure that there was fish passage through all this stuff. So there's 100 different ways of doing this. When we talk about reconnecting floodplains, it depends on what's been disturbed. On this property, remember showing that picture, it had been leveled, with bulldozers and flattened, and levees were put up and all these things. So in this case, we had to literally look at the old situations and get out there with big yellow machines and dig those channels again through these old crop fields and get the flow going from outside the property through the property again, and then back out on the other side of the property to continue on down the creek. Because of the ditching, sometimes you have to fill in ditches. In this instance, because of the loss of the floodplain connection, what happens when you lose a floodplain is the water is forced into a much narrower situation than it would naturally, where it can spread out on the flat area and lose its energy. So you have confined runoff flows from the snow melt forced in a narrow channel that acts like a fire hose. high energy. You're scouring your channel out because the channel is changing its shape to adapt to those high flows. So you have to think about that. What did this channel look like historically? It was probably much smaller or narrower because we had multiple channels and wetlands all through here. It's a situation that is now being termed a stage 0. If you've heard that, if you're involved in creek or river restoration at all, Colin Thorne and others have developed this idea in these really flat areas. You have multiple channels with wetlands all over, soaking wet naturally, and they call it stage 0. So we had stage 0 conditions here, but we didn't know it because that term hadn't been developed yet. So we were reconnecting all these things. And, you know, in this one instance, we had to lift the bottom of the creek back up more closely to where it was historically. And that was those big rock structures that had to do that. And that allowed interaction then with the floodplain. It reduced the incredible energy that we had originally with those spring flows and spread it out, and then allowed the beavers come in and allowed the wetlands to wet and, you know, get wet up again. In some places, we had to even put structures in so we could artificially raise and lower the elevation of the water. Because remember, if we would have just opened up the water, we didn't have the creek and the river flowing like it normally did because of irrigation developments upstream. We're taking water out of the creek. You know, we changed the game. So just getting it wet again isn't going to do it here because the rise and fall of the water isn't natural. That would have been a big weed mess. So we had to fake it with some water control, very simple structures where you just pull a board in or this or that. And then after a while, the beavers would take over. They started filling in our structures, and that was fine too. And so, but thinking about simple management, the fire and the harvest, you know, and that type of thing. But there was 100 different ways of reconnecting the flows. And I would encourage you all, if you're working in floodplains, if you're working in wetlands, think about what you're trying to accomplish first, the functions you're trying to bring back. Think of it from a system standpoint, is what, you know, some of the fancy words we use. And don't just say, oh, this thing worked good over here, let's try that over there. The technique you use to reconnect the hydrologic processes is the last thing. The technique is the last thing you think about. First thing you think about is, what are we trying to accomplish? And then it is, what tool is best in this situation? So I don't want to say one technique is better than another, because all techniques are good. Techniques are bad when we apply them in the wrong situation. So that's the other side of that is, when you do that, when you do, you know, bring the water back, monitor, watch it, see what's going on, live with these lands. Don't just say, oh, I did a restoration and walk away. Restoration is a verb, it's not a noun. Too often we use that word as a verb, as a noun. Oh, I did a restoration, I fixed this thing and walk away. No, you have to live with these things. And this is what we've learned from our native communities. They're out here for thousands of years. They're doing things on the landscape to, you know, keep health into these situations here. If you have a really nice native tule wetland patch in these areas and you never burn it, after a few years, it grows, it accumulates so much dead matter, it chokes itself out. The tules themselves can't grow through that stuff. It's so thick with dead material. So of course they were burning them. You know, it got rid of all that stuff, and it provided good tule growth, which didn't just provide good tules for bats, but also was the best thing for all the wildlife that's using these areas. So it's really fun, and it's different things in different places, but use this approach. And if you can partner with native peoples and learn from them, and the more you can bring things back to historic conditions and use those approaches, you'll be successful. And like I say, even in Wisconsin now, this is the approach we're promoting.
Oh, excuse me if I jutted in, maybe my internet lagged, but thank you, Tracy, for that, and agree completely with everything you're saying, and getting back to understanding what the land was like before and how this can be hard if it's been completely, or if this history has been severed, and figuring out who to talk to and who we can learn from. And often the
Right.
notes that we're reading are from this lens of extraction and conversion. And can you just speak a little bit more about how can we learn what to
Yeah,
emulate? And yeah, can you just speak to
yeah.
that more?
That's one of the hardest parts of doing this, because I mean, my goodness, when you think about, once Europeans came into this country, we were busy, busy, busy boys. And I say boys because it was mostly men doing the work. We've altered so many things. And so many things have been altered for so long, we don't even recognize that they've been altered. So when we were putting the story together of Toppenish Creek, like I told you, when we first talked to the elders, we were scratching our heads saying, I cannot picture what you're talking about. They were talking about how wet this place was, and it was bone dry, when we were there. We had to go back to the glacial times, and it's a really, really cool story, worthy of a whole nother presentation of how this all came together. And it had to do with some very unique things that occurred when the glaciers were retreating 10,000 years ago. They had a thing called Missoula floods, where some very large lakes with ice dams on them in Montana would catastrophically fail the ice dam, and quantities of water would come screaming across eastern Washington state. And when they would get down to the Columbia River, they would dam up. All the debris and junk would dam up. And we're talking, biblical proportions of waters and stuff coming down out of these huge lakes. And what happened in Yakima was, when these dams on the Columbia River from all the debris happened during these catastrophic flood events, it backed water back upstream up the Yakima River, 100 plus miles. And the top of that area was this valley here. So there were like over 100 Missoula floods over the course of a few thousand years that filled this whole valley with silt, and even debris and rocks in some situations, even mammoth skeletons that came in on these Missoula floods. But because it was the top of the flood water, and it stopped and then it drained back out down the river, it created these things they call them tushy beds. And that was the sediment deposits from these gigantic glacial floods. And over time, then the Yakama River was eroding these, deep tushy sediments. And long story short, the Yakama River, as it was doing this, was flowing in the location where Toppenish Creek was. So the Yakama River created this big, broad floodplain. And then as it swept across and moved to where it currently is, little dinky Toppenish Creek came in from behind it and was flowing through this floodplain created by the Yakama River, a much larger river. And that created these incredibly unique characteristics with the multiple channels and the wetlands. And the way the channels were, and this is maybe too much information, but the main channel of the creek in this area historically was the highest part of the floodplain. So the water was flowing to the channel. Well, how can that be? Because when it spills out, the rest of the floodplain is lower than the channel. That doesn't make sense. And that was one of the last pieces we put together. The beavers were in there holding the whole thing together. And when the beavers were removed first, way back when, and then development came in, channelization, all this stuff, all these things came together to dry this area up and create these conditions. So the return of the beavers was a big part. It was one of the last pieces of the puzzle. And I remember being in a meeting with one of our geomorphologists talking about the beavers work they were looking at, and I just got chills. They're like, what's wrong, Hames? I'm like, I finally understand what the elders have been telling us all these years. We finally, 15 years later, put all the pieces together so we could understand what he was describing this landscape looked like, this Toppenish Creek looked like, and it was so cool. And that changed everything in terms of guiding us for the work that we needed to do to get this stuff back. And here's the result, you know, stuff coming out of the ground that nobody expected. Well, it was surprising, but I guess it wasn't unexpected, because we always knew when we took this approach, we always had surprises, and the surprises were always good. But it takes a lot of work doing it, you know, and you have to be thinking, and you have to watch what you're doing, and it takes a lot of people to do it too.
Thank you for sharing a little bit about that. I appreciate how complex the story can be, and I appreciate how you looked back on a glacial scale. It was not a question of what did this look like in 1850. It was a question of how did this system function for thousands of years? We had one question of, again, this idea of these plants seemingly from the land. And can you speak to, and they were wondering if this could happen in Missouri, or could you speak to it maybe on a more national scale?
Good question. Yes. So in Wisconsin, I've been out here 13 years, and we work with a lot of folks, and we've been doing some work in a part of Wisconsin that also has been altered for well over 100 years, in a lot of wetland areas, ditched and cropped, and, you know, et cetera, and grown crops in these wetland soils. There's an area we've been working with where we were able to, you know, adequately bring back the hydrologic functions adequately, and it was a mitigation site. So, you know, the state and the Corps of Engineers required them to seed it to the type of vegetation they wanted, and that was fine, and the stuff grew up well. But about 40% of the plants that grew up in this area, because we fixed the water correctly in this wetland, came up out of the ground. They were not planted in there. They were good native plants that fit it, because the hydrology of this wetland was brought back correctly. The native plants came up. And so there's a university samples ahead of time. And this is, I think, a common practice now with a lot of wetland restoration projects. You can go in and take soil samples and grow it in the lab and see what comes up. And it's amazing. There's seeds and stuff that's in there that can persist for very, very long times. And once you get the conditions right, they're ready to come back again. 100 years? Yeah. I'm not an expert on this subject, but I know it happens. And I know a lot of people are looking at this now and really looking at the soil, at the conditions, and you know, helping determine, do we need to plant stuff or maybe not? You know, with our project, with all this acreage and limited budgets, a lot of it was, well, two reasons. We didn't have the funding to spend a lot of money planting a bunch of stuff. Two, we would be worried about what's the source of these plants. And so if we can get the conditions right and get these plants out, we're pretty confident that these are plants that existed here historically, because we didn't plant them. We didn't bring them from somewhere else. And so that's really what we wanted here. And so I would encourage folks working in wetlands or riparian areas or anywhere else. Now, that wasn't true in this landscape with the upland areas, because the upland grasses had been lost. If we just would have left them grow, they would have just come up to weeds. So we did have to get seed sources in this area, in these floodplains. The native grass was what they call Great Basin wild rye. So we did have to seed those fields in, and then do burning and things like that, and do some management to get the uplands back. But the wetlands, riparian areas, you know, fix it right, came in. But please use that approach. And if you're in other parts of the nation, try it out, see what happens. And too often we think of restoration, and especially wetland restoration, as gardening. We think, oh, I want to have this or that kind of vegetation community. So we do some stuff and we get it reconnected or whatever we do, and then we plant, and then we tend our garden. And that's fine if you're working on small acreages. But if you're working on 22,000 acres and you've got a crew of 5 people managing all this stuff, you've got to come up with ways that help nature and help it manage it itself. So we don't have the luxury, if we want to get to scale, if we're going to treat these things like little gardens. I mean, they're treated as gardens, but they were managed in a very large way by the Yakama people.
Thank you.
If
We
that's
had,
helpful.
it is helpful. No, this is all very helpful. Thank you. We had one question that I can answer quickly, but it's about the Wapato, and the viewer was wondering if it grows in the lower Midwest. And as you mentioned, Tracy, yes, duck potato, broadleaf arrowhead, Sagittaria, latifolia, grows throughout wetlands in Missouri. We have an upcoming webinar from Dr. Nadia Navarrete-Tyndall, who's going to talk about growing edible plants. But could you just speak a little bit more about this species, maybe in its harvest or its preparation or the relationship that you've developed with it?
Yeah. So, I'm a Midwestern boy. I grew up in Minnesota, got my master's degree in Wisconsin back in the 80s and did a lot of wetland work. And so I knew, especially as a waterfowl guy, I knew Sagittaria very well. And there's a lot of different species, but latifolia is one of the commonest, and it's all around the nation. So I was really familiar with this plant and really familiar knowing that Sagittaria is one of those plants that really thrives along river systems in those wetlands where you have the high water and then you have the drop off later in the summer. In the Midwest here, that's, a lot of our duck managers want to grow arrowhead because it's also utilized by waterfowl a lot. And so we knew about, a classic way of getting Wapato back here in the Midwest is to do a drawdown, on your wetland area, let it dry up. And then the next year the Sagittaria explodes. And that's good, for the birds, etc. So when I first saw Wapato coming up at Yakama, I was, wow, there it is. I was able to see it right away because I was so familiar with that plant, but also knowing that it had been so lost. And so then we were able to look at it and monitor it and see it start to slowly at first, but then expand. And with that management, it became, a dominant plant in these wetlands along with the tules. So knowing that it's a tuber, and I'd never eaten it, before, we just thought of it as wildlife food. But the first time we started growing it, I'm like, all right, I'll dig up some of these tubers. I brought them home and peeled them and boiled them up just like you'd do a boiled potato. And I made mashed Wapato tuber potatoes and ate them with butter. And it made my mouth really dry. It didn't work out very well at all. So it was very interesting to see, and I don't know the recipes, but when the Yakamas were reconnecting with this plant and then exploring the ways to prepare it, I mean, they were doing this all on their own, and it was so exciting, and they had really good ways of preparing it and serving it and getting it out and utilizing it. Because if we're not utilizing these areas, traditionally, what are we doing this stuff for? So that was really exciting. I will say one other really interesting thing that happened when the Wapato started coming back in big numbers. Guess what else responded? We started getting swans. Now this is an area, the Yakama Reservation is a wintering area for waterfowl. And so we get, it's warm enough, it can get real cold, but it's warm enough where ducks and geese and swans stay there all winter long. And the first, once we started getting Wapato in wetland areas, the swans moved in the fall, and they'd be there all winter long, and they were hanging out right in the place where the Wapato was coming back. And I was like, oh my goodness, no way. They're going to eat up all our Wapato. And you'd go out there in the spring and you'd see all the divots from where they were digging up the Wapato tubers. And I don't know why, but it's my experience here that in the places where the swans were digging up the Wapato and were doing their feeding, those places came in the thickest. And I don't know if it had anything to do with swan herbivory or anything, but it was great. So we didn't care about the swans. We'd have 300 swans all winter long, hanging out in these wetlands. No surprise, I guess, because guess what? Swans and Wapato evolved together for thousands and thousands of years. So all these connections start coming back that you didn't notice or you didn't know about, and you start seeing how all these things come together. So that's, I guess, the best I can say about Wapato, but it is throughout the nation, and it's such a neat plant, and there are many different species of it. And if you want to explore Wapato, you will have some, I'm sure, nearby. That's it.
Well, thank you so much, Tracy. I feel like I could listen to you speak on this for hours. This was a really fascinating and encouraging talk. So thank you. Thank you so much for this.
And I will encourage everybody, if you're interested in these types of things, get out in the mud, get out there, explore, learn. Best way to do this stuff is to be in these wetlands, experiencing them, observing them, and you'll learn a lot.
All right, and I'm back. Thanks, Tracy and Lily, for taking us through the live questions. As a reminder, access to this recording and other related information shared by Tracy is going to be sent to all who registered in a follow-up email on Friday. Now I'd like to do a review of upcoming in-person and online events. Register now and join us at 4 p.m. on June 25th for our long-awaited Grow Native Masterclass on native perennials for planting on slopes with Shannon Curry, Leader of Education and Outreach at Grow Native member Isel Native Plants. In this session, we'll explore what plants work best on slopes, discuss objectives for managing slopes, and much, much more. This live masterclass includes a presentation and question and answer session. As a masterclass, a recording will only be made available to those who have registered. And the webinar is free to MPF dues paying members and Grow Native professional members and will be $15 for non-members. Masterclass fees go to support our nonprofit conservation work, so visit our MPF membership page to become a member and attend all of these masterclasses for free. Next, register for Grow Native Wetlands webinar, Growing Edible Plants for Food and Wildlife. Now, this was mentioned by Lily earlier, but just as a reminder, it's planned for July 2nd at 4 p.m. We're going to be rejoined by Dr. Nadia Navarat-Tindall, Grow Native Committee member, professor, Extension State Specialist at Lincoln University in Missouri, and more for a webinar exploring edible native bottomland and wetland plants. Registration is available on our website for free. As for our in-person events, we're excited to share that there are 3 Native Home Garden Tours and 2 Grow Native Garden of Excellence Tours planned for the next few weeks. Hop off the computer and meet other enthusiasts in the wild for guided tours with seasoned gardeners. All are welcome. Attending is as easy as registering and coming out. The tours will be held in Ladue, Mansfield, Springfield, Jefferson City, and Brentwood. Register at grownative.org for those events. We also have a prairie tour and bumblebee atlas training at Morton Family Prairie coming up on Saturday, June 21st from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. No ID experience is needed. Just pack a sack lunch and enjoy time on the prairie. Register online at moprairie.org. We really hope you can make it out to learn about the Missouri Bumblebee Atlas in honor of International Pollinator Week, which is happening right now. For the latest event updates, remember to sign up for our bi-weekly newsletter to get these events and much more directly in your inbox. Thank you for joining us, and thanks again to you, Tracy, for sharing about this inspirational restoration.
Thanks again, and all you, keep your feet wet.
I love it. Everybody have a great night. Maybe out there on a wetland. Take care.